This talk is for those who stand at a very particular threshold in life. Those who, in their 60s and beyond, are considering remarriage or cohabitation. And equally, for those who are already inside such a relationship yet feel an unnameable discomfort, something subtle but persistent, as if the ground beneath the connection is not entirely stable, because love at this stage of life is not what it once was. In youth, love begins with emotion. It is driven by attraction, by possibility, by projection. But later in life, something shifts. Structure comes before emotion. Calculation precedes feeling. And the central question is no longer, can I be happy with this person? It becomes, can I avoid being hurt again? This is not cynicism. It is memory. And so the purpose of this talk is not to determine who is right or wrong in these relationships. Rather, it is to examine carefully and philosophically what must be understood, what must be questioned, and what must be chosen with courage when two people attempt to build a life together in later years. Because love in old age is no longer a romantic problem. It is an existential one. At this stage, relationships often serve multiple hidden functions. They can become an escape from loneliness, a buffer against the fear of loss, or even a structure through which one attempts to regain control over a life that has, at times, felt uncontrollable. And here lies the first critical insight. What must be approached with the greatest caution is not conflict, nor difference, but anxiety disguised as love. You will often hear phrases like, fairness is what makes a relationship last. We each have our own lives. At our age, everything should be clear and defined. None of these statements are inherently wrong, but the question is not whether they are correct. The question is, what is their origin? If such principles arise from love, they can support a relationship. But if they are rooted in fear, then even the most stable-looking relationship may already lack what we might call an emotional commons, a shared inner life. At this point, it is helpful to turn to a profound philosophical text, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. This text explores how, after loss, the human mind becomes attached to form, to boundaries, to structure. It suggests that when impermanence is not fully accepted, we do not open ourselves to relationships, we close them into systems. And this is precisely what we often observe in late-life partnerships. True maturity, in this context, is not the insistence that we remain separate individuals. Rather, it is the willingness to say, even knowing that loss is inevitable, I still choose to be intertwined with another. That is courage. Without that courage, relationships may appear peaceful on the surface, but beneath, they remain unformed, emotionally incomplete. Now, let us move deeper. Consider a particular behavioral pattern that frequently emerges among older men in relationships. The insistence that their partner must contribute a portion of living expenses no matter how financially secure the man may be. At first glance, this seems reasonable, even principled, but psychologically, it often reveals something far more complex. Let us examine three structural types behind this behavior. The first is what we may call the conditional fairness type. This individual frequently uses language such as fairness, 50-50, and shared responsibility. However, the underlying objective is not fairness itself. It is the preservation of psychological and moral advantage. There are two core anxieties at work here. First, the fear that giving more may lead to being controlled or exploited. Second, the desire to transform financial contribution into a safety mechanism within the relationship. Even when financially comfortable, this individual will intentionally divide costs. They may say, money isn't the issue, but principles matter. Yet what appears as rationality is in fact a subtle system of relational control. The second type is the affective financial detachment type. This is perhaps the most internally conflicted. They desire companionship but resist forming a fully shared life. Their accounts are separate. Their expenses are separate. Even their emotional responsibilities are implicitly separate. You may hear statements like, "We each have our own lives." At this age, independence is what makes a relationship strong. But what is presented as maturity often conceals avoidance. This type is shaped by past experiences, divorce, betrayal, loss. From these experiences emerges a deeply ingrained belief. To be entangled is to be vulnerable, and to be vulnerable is to lose. And so they construct relationships that are carefully partitioned. They want connection, but without fusion. Closeness, but without shared fate. Here we encounter a profound paradox. They are afraid of being alone, yet even more afraid of being fully together. Their avoidance does not appear in overt rejection. It manifests in the architecture of daily life, in how money is handled, how decisions are made, how boundaries are enforced, and crucially, while costs are separated, control is not shared. This asymmetry is not accidental. It is the core of the structure. The third type is the late life control restoration type. These individuals often carry histories of powerlessness, financial exploitation, emotional betrayal, or a loss of agency within past relationships. And so, consciously or not, they enter new relationships with a silent declaration. This time, I will be in control. For them, money is not simply currency. It is a symbol of relevance, of security, of irreplaceability. And this leads to a particularly revealing behavioral pattern. They may cover the majority of shared expenses, but insist that their partner always contributes a portion. Not too little, not too much. Typically somewhere between 20 and 50%. This is not arbitrary. If the amount is too small, it carries no psychological weight. If too large, it creates resistance. But within this range, something subtle occurs. The partner feels invested, but also constrained. A quiet psychological anchor is formed. I've already put something into this relationship. Leaving would feel like a loss. This is not generosity. It is not even fairness. It is the creation of a controlled attachment system. From the perspective of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, this behavior reflects a deeper dynamic. The text teaches that what binds consciousness most strongly, especially in transitional states, is not love, but attachment born of existential anxiety. In later life, we stand at the threshold between what might be called the bardo of living and the bardo of dying. At this threshold, attachment often disguises itself as care, as structure, as rationality. But at its core, it asks only three questions. Am I still connected? Am I still chosen? Am I still necessary? When one compels the other to contribute even partially, it is not merely about money. It is an attempt to bind the relationship into a mutual structure of attachment, not to love together, but to ensure that neither can easily leave. In classical Buddhist terms, this is not compassion. It is Trishna craving, a thirst that seeks not union, but security against loss. And this is where the real question emerges. Not, is this relationship fair? But, is this relationship open? Or is it simply carefully controlled? Because in the end, a relationship built on structure alone may endure, but it will never truly become a shared life. So we arrive at a critical question. If this structure, this insistence on partial financial contribution is not simply about fairness, then why does it rarely strike people as strange? Why is it not rejected as controlling, but instead accepted as reasonable? When an older man says, I will pay most of it, but you should pay some, the people around him often respond in ways that sound almost self-evident. Well, that's better than him paying everything. These days, women should contribute too. A relationship lasts longer when both share the burden. At first glance, these seem like harmless opinions, but in reality, they are something far more powerful. They are the result of a long-standing cultural consensus. To understand this, we must step back into the historical psychology of a generation. For many men now in their later years, particularly those shaped by periods of rapid industrial and economic expansion, money was never just money. It was identity. It was duty. It was authority. The implicit formula of that era was simple. The man earns. The one who pays decides. Economic responsibility equals relational control. Within such a framework, paying everything is not necessarily seen as generosity. It can feel like overexposure, even vulnerability. To say, "I will take care of everything," is not always experienced as kindness. It can feel like placing oneself in a position where control might be lost, and so a compromise emerges. He retains leadership, but distributes responsibility. Now, let us examine a phrase that appears deceptively modern. Fairness is what makes a relationship last. To a contemporary Western ear, this sounds like equality, mutual respect, balanced partnership. But in this context, the meaning is more subtle and more strategic. What it often implies is this: you too must become invested in a way that makes leaving difficult. Here, fairness does not mean equal rights. It means equal entanglement. When shared expenses are tied to pleasurable experiences, dining, travel, leisure, something important happens. Emotion and expenditure become intertwined, and the relationship begins to anchor itself not only in feeling, but in accumulated investment. This is not an explicit strategy. It is rarely conscious, but it is a deeply effective one. Now, this behavior does not exist in isolation. It is reinforced quietly but persistently by the surrounding environment. Friends may say, "If you pay for everything, resentment will build." Children may warn, "Don't get involved with someone who only spends your money." Peers might advise, "That's how you avoid being taken for granted." Notice the pattern. Each of these perspectives assumes one thing as a baseline: not trust, but potential betrayal. The relationship is not designed around love. It is engineered around risk management. And within such an environment, asking a partner to contribute 20 to 50% is no longer seen as manipulation. It becomes reframed as wise self-protection. There is also a deeper structural asymmetry at play. In later life relationships, the market, if we may call it, that is not neutral. Many men bring financial stability. Many women bring emotional intelligence, relational care, and the capacity for companionship. In this dynamic, money becomes more than a resource. It becomes an entry point into the relationship itself. And this creates a quiet but persistent anxiety in the male psyche. Is she here for me or for what I provide? To resolve this tension, the man does not fully weaponize his resources, but neither does he fully relinquish them. Instead, he constructs a middle ground. I will give more, but not everything. You will give less, but not nothing. This ambiguity is precisely what gives the structure its strength. From the perspective of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, we encounter a profound insight. Attachment does not arise from the individual mind alone. It is often validated and reinforced by the environment. When a culture begins to normalize fear-based behavior, attachment disguises itself as virtue. The older individual is told, "Don't end up alone. At your age, opportunities are limited. A little calculation is only realistic." And so what begins as fear gradually transforms into something that appears rational, even admirable. Craving, what Buddhist philosophy calls Trishna, is no longer recognized as craving. It is mistaken for responsibility. for prudence, for maturity. And here lies the subtle danger. The individual no longer perceives themselves as controlling. They see themselves as reasonable. But from a philosophical standpoint, this is a classic case of anxiety crystallizing into structure. Now we must go deeper still. Why insist so persistently that the other person must contribute? Why not simply give? The answer lies in a central anxiety of later life. Am I still someone who is chosen? At this stage, many traditional markers of value have shifted or diminished. Youth, physical vitality, social status. What often remains most tangible is economic capacity and decision-making authority. And so relationships subtly shift from emotion-centered to condition-centered. The unspoken question becomes, does she care for me or for what I represent? And the fastest way to regulate this uncertainty is to introduce shared financial participation. On the surface, the reasoning sounds practical. It's normal for both people to contribute. I don't want you to feel uncomfortable receiving too much. It keeps things balanced. But beneath these statements, a different logic unfolds. If the relationship becomes contractual, it becomes predictable. If expectations are divided, disappointment is reduced. If disappointment is reduced, the risk of abandonment feels lower. In this sense, cost sharing is not about money. It is a mechanism for managing emotional risk. There is also a deeper layer of control. An older man may instinctively resist a structure in which the woman receives everything without contributing. Why? Because such a structure implies three things. She remains free to leave at any time. He becomes fixed as the provider. She is the recipient. Over time, relational leverage may shift away from him. To counter this, he introduces a balancing statement. Since you contribute as well, we are equal. But this equality is not purely relational. It is strategic. It reduces the ease of exit. And so what appears socially acceptable, even wise, is in fact part of a broader cultural system. A system that says, in later life, clarity matters more than emotion. Financial boundaries prevent future conflict. Love must be realistic. These narratives serve a function. They protect individuals from emotional exposure. But they also allow control to disguise itself as rationality. Again, the Tibetan Book of the Dead offers a striking parallel. It teaches that, near the threshold of death, the human mind clings most strongly not to love itself, but to form, possession, and control. What we are observing here is not an attempt to hold on to love. It is an attempt to stabilize what is inherently unstable. When someone says, let's both contribute, what may be spoken underneath is something far more vulnerable. Please don't disappear from my life. And yet, this structure, while stabilizing for one, can become constraining for the other. For the woman, what begins as a reasonable arrangement can gradually transform into something more subtle, a quiet form of self-monitoring. Before expressing a need, she calculates. Before receiving, she feels indebted. Before hoping, she restrains herself. The relationship continues, but something within her begins to recede. And then, one day, over what appears to be a trivial issue, a small expense, a minor disagreement, the accumulated tension surfaces. The man says, we agreed on this from the beginning. And the woman feels, somewhere along the way, I disappeared. At this point, conversations may increase, but understanding diminishes. The deeper lesson is this. The more we attempt to reduce anxiety by reinforcing structure, the more we risk suffocating the very relationship we are trying to protect. Because a relationship is not sustained by control. It is sustained by the willingness to remain open despite uncertainty. In our next talk, we will go further. We will examine how these financial structures, over time, transform within the inner world of the woman into self-censorship, emotional withdrawal, and silent distance, and why, paradoxically, more communication can sometimes make things worse. And finally, we will confront a single sentence, often spoken by the man at the end, that quietly closes the door on repair. Love in later life does not begin with calculation. It begins with the courage to reduce it, not by strengthening control, but by acknowledging fear. If this reflection has been meaningful to you, I invite you to subscribe and share, because there are many who are trying to build relationships, not merely on structure, but on something far more difficult: maturity. I will see you in the next conversation.